Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news around the world from the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, June 14, another big week for elections, for summit meetings, and for stalled negotiations. We begin with a look at the European Union elections, which concluded last Sunday. The results were, in some ways, as expected, a shift to the right throughout Europe, but with the center overall holding. The bigger impact was within member states where incumbents from Olaf Scholz to Viktor Orban suffered big losses, though none as much as Emmanuel Macron, who called a snap parliamentary election to try and retake the initiative. What will all this mean for the European role on the global stage? Then, the leaders of the largest democracies are gathering in Bari, Italy this week for the G7 summit. All but the host, Giorgia Meloni, arrived in a weakened political state. It sort of looks like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. For some of this may in fact be their last G7 meeting. Perhaps that explains the hurry to get some big things done, notably on Ukraine. And then finally, we take a look at Secretary Blinken's 8th trip to the Middle East to try and salvage a ceasefire agreement that seemingly both warring parties are rejecting. Is there any hope left for an end to the fighting in Gaza? And if not, can the escalating fighting between Israel and Hezbollah be stemmed from becoming a full-scale war? Here to talk about these issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Karen DeYoung is senior national security correspondent at The Washington Post. Matt Kaminski is editor-at-large at Politico. And Stefan Kornelius is political editor at the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Good morning, good afternoon, Stefan, to you all. Wonderful to see you on what in Chicago at least is a gorgeous morning. Although in the world maybe not so much. Stefan, let's start with you. European elections, big elections, probably got more attention, I think, this time around than they normally do, in part because of what they mean for the future of Europe, but I guess really because of the temperature means for national governments, notably your own in Germany, where the coalition really suffered a major setback, and of course in France, where the far right won more than twice as many votes as the president's party. How do you look now? Now we're almost a week afterwards. How do you look at the elections, and what do you think it means?
Well, it's a gorgeous evening in Munich as well, and it's the evening where the European soccer tournament starts. So this is the good news for Europe. The bad news is that those elections had some unwanted fallouts, even though in its core, those elections, as you rightly say, were not a surprise at all. We saw a slight turn to the right in the European Parliament. It's a remarkable achievement still that 27 countries can vote and can find majorities for their parliament. And that all serves to find the European leadership body, which then governs the council and then the commission. It's all fine. It's all done nicely. And all in all, most countries have not shown too many surprises. The big two ones, however, Germany and France did. And this is what impacts the European Union. And again, for all those who wonder what those two geographic mites in the center of Europe have an impact on the continent, this is the proof. In France, Macron's party lost significantly, which again led to a major loss of the liberal wing in the European Parliament. And in Germany, the right-wing AfD gained, which again led to an increase of votes of the right-wing bloc in the European Parliament. And this shifts the powers not that much in Europe because it's all basically balanced by other fascinating, interesting sub-results. Take Scandinavia, for example, where the left gains. Take Poland, where the center holds. Take Hungary, most surprisingly, where Viktor Orban loses. But Germany and France are the ones who call the shots. And this is why it was so utterly surprising that, or probably not in the end, we might discuss this, but that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, took those European elections as a pretext to sort out affairs domestically, and which means he called for snap elections. he's already governing in the so-called cohabitation, which means the strong French president has not a majority in parliament, so he has to rely on alternatives. The alternatives right now are moderate parties in the French parliament, but they are threatening to destabilize his reign already, probably with next budget. So he wanted to preempt this entire destabilizing, self-destructing situation in France and call for elections, forcing the electorate to make up their mind, tell them this is the right wing on the march. Marine Le Pen, the president of the Front National, the right-wing leading party, which has the majority in France, is about to take over power in France. And please, voters, make up your mind, come to the polls, tell them that you don't want them. Now, which might be a nice call for an intellectual audience, doesn't work that much in the broad sense. The reaction was just horrific. Macron was dropped immediately from all sort of good, well-meaning democratic center parties. The left realigned, joined forces together, which means we're talking about some serious left shifts here. And the center entirely imploded. Macron's own party did, and so did the Renaissance, and so did the Republicans, which are the conservative parties. They self-destructed. Their leader now wants to join forces with Le Pen on the right wing. So we have a totally chaotic scene in France, which most likely will not be sorted out within the next 3 weeks, and which might lead to a right-wing government, prime minister in France, which will then has to live with Macron as a president, and they will basically shelve each other off. They will just close the doors, and France will basically will be immobile until the presidential elections in 2027. Now, the fun thing is, or not, that's not fun actually, but the interesting thing is Germany is taking a little bit more time, but the loss of the governing coalition, mostly the Social Democrats with Olaf Scholz as a chancellor, who ended up at 12 point something percent, led to a pretty delayed by a week sort of a reaction by the parliamentary basis. Those Social Democrats now are fearing about their power, about their seats in parliament. They know that there will be a national impact. There's a leadership meeting on Sunday in Berlin, where Scholz will be challenged, where Scholz will be asked to draw consequences, to do something about it. He might get rid of some party sort of bureaucrats, party leader types, the general secretary, or even the party chairman. But his own performance as a chancellor, his inability to verbally react, to take this crisis serious, to address the problems and to lead the coalition, this is now on the shelf. And we are talking about a probable lifetime for the coalition of three parties for the next 4 weeks to probably 3 months, because this is when crunch time ends. This is when the budget has to be decided upon. And this is then when probably Scholz has to ask for a vote of confidence, because he simply cannot trust his coalition partners to hold his majority any longer. So praise for impact in Europe. This is going to be bad, even though parliament is stable. And funny enough, even though the commission now and all the top positions in the European level will be decided upon extremely fast, basically have a set of people now being in place to be voted in office, Ursula von der Leyen at the helm of it. Even that is happening. The national level is weakened, and that spells trouble for all things Ukraine, for all things transatlantic security, stability, and for the next years. We basically will look inward.
Stefan, that's a sobering picture, and sort of the obverse of what we used to think: strong national governments and a weak European government. And now we have a strong European government, or at least strong European leaders, but weak national governments with consequences. Matt, you're a long-time observer of politics in Europe. What is your reaction to what Stefan said, and sort of, do you see it the same way, that we're in for months of deep instability, if not longer than that?
Well, I find myself on the other side of the Atlantic for the last 5 years, and I guess my reaction is we've been asking for European politics to come to life for decades. We wanted a European-wide political theater, and now we have it. And I think when you dig through the details of what Stefan just laid out, there are some fascinating, I think it's fascinating, first of all. Fascinating that in Poland, the party that had been winning for the last decade was so lost again. Orban on the back foot. In Germany, Olaf Scholz is a weak leader, so he's losing votes. That is democracy. Similarly, in France, what's happening in France, I think in France, it's the most interesting case for me, and it's the country where I probably spent the most time, is that Emmanuel Macron has unleashed forces that he cannot control anymore. And I was in Paris about a week ago for the first time in about 2 years, and the country is different. It is a lot more open to the world economically. It is a lot more pro-Atlanticist, very hawkish on Russia. And politically, it is utterly unrecognizable from what it had been. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think we've been waiting for Europe and we've been waiting for France to get a little bit shaken up. And Macron may get squeezed out. I mean, the thing is, he basically destroyed the old kind of doddering Socialist Party and the old doddering Republican Party. And he was trying to create this movement in the middle. And now he may be about to get squeezed out by this resurgent left, led in part by Raphael Glucksmann, who's a very interesting young politician. Then you have the former Front National, now called the RN, the National, I don't remember the damn name.
L'Assemblée Nationale. Right?
L'Assemblée Nationale, okay. And by Le Pen, but really the face of it is a 28-year-old guy named Jordan Bardella. They sound different than they used to be. And this is the new face of European politics. And by the way, we're going to get to the G7 in a minute. If the new face of European politics is Giorgia Meloni, that's not the worst face of European politics. We thought she would be Mussolini in a dress. It turns out she is the most impressive leader on the European stage right now. And in terms of this represents some kind of political renewal, I don't think it is necessarily a bad thing because Europe needs some sort of renewal.
Aaron, when you look at it from Washington, I mean, what's sort of your impression of whether this is, finally real politics in Europe or the collapsing center in the motor, the Franco-German motor? I'd add one of the things that is remarkable is these were elections, they were held, and nobody called them rigged. Which is, I think, always a good thing when you have elections, and it's only recently that we start marveling about that reality. But that's the way it is. So how do you see it, Karen?
Well, I don't think anybody can underestimate the extent to which the United States is looking inward at the moment, as are many of the countries in Europe. The problem is we don't have this sort of many countries together all vote together to come up with some sort of joint position, which is, as we've just heard, moving toward the right. Things are definitely moving toward the right here. But I think that as you look at this in the frame of U.S. politics, I think that a lot of the same issues obviously motivated people in Europe: migration, climate, inflation. And the question is, what does this mean depending on who wins the U.S. election? Biden's gotten a lot and Europe on its own has moved forward a lot with a lot of moves on climate. What does this mean? If Biden stays in office, what does it mean if Trump comes to office? Similarly on migration. And I think the sort of long-term question is, if you posit another Trump administration, does he find fellow travelers on the right in Europe? I suspect not, because I think Trump does not have a sort of worldview and doesn't have the sort of deep commitment to things abroad unless he can relate them domestically. And I think that I just don't see a Trump presidency sort of finding common ground with Europe on any level. whether it's Ukraine, whether it's climate, whether it's migration, other than with migration sort of saying, yeah, they don't want these people, we don't want these people.
I disagree a little bit.
I think it'd be really interesting.
I think, Karen, Trump might not find common ground on a substantial basis, on sort of a policy basis, but they definitely find it inspiring, his leadership style and his ad hoc policies, most likely on Ukraine. So he might follow us. And this is why, Matt, I don't agree with your view that Meloni is the good face. I mean, she's honestly a wolf in a sheep's coat. She's turning Italy inward out. She's changing the constitution. She's organizing all around a new power principle. And yes, she's making noise on Ukraine and Russia and saying the right things on Europe. But the way she takes away liberties inside Italy really reminds me of the early Orban phase. So she really hasn't shown her right face. And the Front National, the former Front National, the now Republic RN, and Bardella. I mean, he's a 29-year-old guy who was sent into European Parliament because he works on TikTok so nicely. But this is a threat. They are openly against the European Union. They're openly pro-Russia. They will destruct NATO from within. So I don't think this is doing good to Europe. I totally agree that Europe probably needs a more realistic approach to its problems, and more conservative governments might be able to deliver. But on the nationalistic view, I tend to stick to the old word of François Mitterrand, nationalisme c'est la guerre, nationalism is war. And this is really the beginning of something we really have to watch carefully.
Yeah, but I think I would just distinguish between the political style and the modern political method, and where personality, being able to connect directly with your voters. And by the way, the successful politicians are not just far-right politicians, they're also on the left who are able to kind of speak in a modern language and understand that, there are just much fewer layers between the politician and the voter than there ever were before, including with us, with the media. We were one of the layers. We're pretty much been kind of not removed from the scene, but we're not as important. The buffers were also party machines. So there's a different political style, and that seems to go in hand with a kind of more pragmatic approach on policy. I would think that Trump doesn't have a consistent worldview. He doesn't even have a worldview, but that means that when he was in office, he did all kinds of things that really didn't kind of add up in a certain sense. And I think you see that as well from politicians in Europe. So, like it or not, to win elections in a democracy, and these are all still democracies, you have to be good on TikTok, and you have to know how to communicate a clear message. And Donald Tusk is very good at communicating a clear message in Poland, which is why he won. Raphael Glucksmann, as I mentioned before, who's a French socialist, got them from, barely alive to 15%, the same level that Macron had, because he was also a very modern style politician. So, I would just distinguish between the theater of politics and the facts of governing. And when we come to the facts of governing, all these leaders, including Trump, will be balancing all kinds of inputs and pressures, including from the security establishment, the business establishment, which is why when anyone tends to come to power, they don't tend to go as extreme as we often fear, with notable exceptions, which is Orban. But then he seems to be losing a little bit of his mojo right now.
I guess, I think this, I really like this distinction, because I think this is the big question. And I don't know whether we have the answer, and we will in many ways see, and we'll actually see it also how it plays out in the election in France. But I think the real question is whether the shift to the right is the center becoming more rightist in order to take part of the far right and make it part of its own conversation, or whether the shift to the right is the far right pulling the center so far away that it becomes part of its own politics. And I don't know whether we have the answer. Clearly, this is the bet that is happening in the new coalition in the Netherlands. We'll see what it means in France. You could argue that the CDU-CSU did well because, in part, the AfD did not do as well. in Germany and clearly in Hungary and in Poland, all good news. But then, and in some ways in Italy too, where Meloni may be far right, but she won votes from the far right. But we don't know how it plays out in governing. Other than the Italian case, at least I think on the foreign policy side is more moderate than it is on the domestic policy side, and we'll have to weigh and see where it ends up.
And you've got the UK elections coming.
And you got the UK election, which is clearly where not only is it going left, but it's going to the center, because Labour is running as a centrist party.
Unless Nigel Farage manages to completely destroy the Conservative Party, which is how it may.
Yeah, no, but if he does, then you have 400 seats for Labour, right? And you have single party rule, but run from the center, at least for a long time. Fascinating. I mean, just to emphasize Matt's point, this is how democracy works. Democracy isn't always clean, but at least as long as you can have more votes down the road, then when it doesn't work out the right way, you can throw them out. That used to be how we did business in democracy. Hopefully, we can continue to do that. Let me shift over to the G7, Matt, and talk a little bit about. I unkindly called this Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but it is the case that Meloni is arriving, on the top of doing extremely well in the elections. That every single other person, from Kishida to Biden to Trudeau, three people we have not talked to, coming in weakened, and of course Rishi Sunak is. Even more unkindly, dead man walking. He will be gone on the 4th of July. So what was the impact of the sort of the domestic political reality facing the G7 leaders on the G7 conversation and decisions?
Well, I think as you were saying, you're trying to imagine the G7 a year from now, and you can very easily imagine Trump being in that picture. Harder, but not impossible to imagine Le Pen being in that group shot, at least not in 2025, but maybe in 2027. Trudeau's going to go out to a mainstream conservative, most likely next year. Sunak's going to go out to a mainstream, center-left guy, Keir Starmer. So it does feel a little bit like a photo at the retirement house where a lot of those guys don't look very healthy. I think practically speaking, it did make this summit feel pretty small. They got the good news for Ukraine, and the good news, I think, in my view, for European security is that they got this agreement to continue aid to the Ukrainians. Biden has made a 10-year commitment. Who knows if that would last if you have a change in November, but a 10-year security commitment to Ukraine. There is a consensus now in the G7 to tap into those frozen Russian sovereign accounts and use the interest on them to help the Ukrainians pay for the war. And generally, as much as the mood is at least dark among let's say a lot of people in Europe, especially in the European mainstream about politics, I do think, and it's not very happy on Gaza, where there are no easy solutions right now. On Ukraine, I'm picking up a little bit more positive tone about what's going on. And I think that's the most relevant backdrop for Europe, and probably the most relevant backdrop for this G7, that because of the delay in the US Congress, the Russians had an opening. The Ukrainians couldn't really, they couldn't make any forward progress, but they were actually being pushed back by the Russians in the spring. It felt like around Kharkiv, that city was in danger. That's been stopped. That Russian offensive has stalled. The Ukrainians have had two big successes, which I think are worth talking about because they don't get talked about as often. That Biden's decision, at last, too late, why drip, but still, Biden's decision to let the Ukrainians use American weapons to strike into Russia, and finally having some of those weapons delivered to the front line, has let the Ukrainians take some momentum back and make them feel pretty good about holding the line on the east. And more importantly, the Ukrainians have completely neutralized Crimea as a Ukrainian, as a Russian forward base into Ukraine. They've actually destroyed more than half the Black Sea Fleet. They've forced the rest of it to move to Novorossiysk. Grain exports are now going out completely unhindered out of Ukraine, which is a huge success for them. So there are reasons to feel better than one felt 2 months ago about Ukraine. It may explain why Putin came out this morning with his latest peace proposal, which is effectively asking for a Ukrainian capitulation, which they will not accept, although there will be people in the West who may be tempted by this as an opening to stop the war. I don't think Putin's ever going to stop the war until he controls Kiev one way or another, but that's a good news. The great unanswered question is, again, if you have a change in the U.S., what will the new administration do on Ukraine? And that is, I know, making many, many people, most of all the Ukrainians, very nervous.
No, I think that's right. And Karen, I think the administration is trying with the signing of the bilateral security agreement that Matt mentioned, the agreement on the $50 billion used for Russian assets, and I think very importantly, probably less reported, the new sanctions regime, which is really now emasculating the Russian financial system in a way it hadn't been before, by threatening banks around the world that if they do business with Russia and Russian entities, that they will be shut out of the U.S. Financial market. Really trying to send a message. We're in this. When we say for as long as it takes, we mean for as long as it takes. I think that's the message that the G7 is trying to send and the U.S. is trying to send. And then you look at the politics and said, well, that's great, but for how long? How does the administration answer that question when you talk to folks in Washington?
I think that none of these things that were decided as far as the United States is concerned are irreversible. The frozen assets, this requires, it's basically a loan using the interest on the frozen assets as collateral, but the member countries have to come up with the money first of all. And I think it's something like half of it is supposed to come from the United States. You guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like $25 billion or something that are guaranteed with these frozen assets, which the interest rates come up with several billion a year, but it's not like, oh, you can get all the money back tomorrow, because it's not going to be there. It'll sort of dribble in over the years. So I think that the security agreement, that could be canceled in a day. It's
6 months. 6 months notice. You can withdraw up on 6 months.
Right. Yep. Right. That's right. But Congress could also pass legislation saying we don't want to do this.
Right.
And so I think that it's a commitment. It is an issue where the Republican Party is not as cohesive as it is on some other issues. There are many Republicans who are very supportive of Ukraine. There are many who see it as an economic issue and say, why are we helping them out? There are still others who say, maybe Russia's not that bad and we should be friends with them. So you don't have, as with so many other issues, you don't have a really unified position. Similarly with the Democrats, I mean, there are people who say, why are we giving up all this money? But I think they're a bit more cohesive. So yeah, it depends on the politics here, but I think it's a good move forward. It is the administration doing as much as it can to lock this stuff in, and they sort of had to go forward with the security agreement, having urged everybody else to sign them, and we being in the sort of latecomers to actually signing an agreement. We'll have the NATO summit here next month, and they'll do some more for Ukraine. I think that they say there'll be further steps on NATO membership. I don't think it will go that far. I think for all the reasons that we've just laid out, I think the summit will be kind of a holding pattern. They've decided this week to establish this new command to coordinate stuff for Ukraine based in Germany. I don't quite understand how that's much different than what we already have. But yeah.
It's trying to put a NATO imprimatur on the actions that are so far not under NATO.
It is NATO more sort of acknowledging,
right? And that's
we're in this.
It brings NATO closer to these activities than it was up to this point,
right?
But it does raise, Stefan, sort of your perspective. It does raise the question whether weakened political leaders can maintain the momentum that maybe is achieved at the G7 and maybe at NATO beyond, because the reality is that political support for Ukraine is also not universal in Germany or in other European countries.
Well, I think all those operations we see now at G7, at the Swiss summit on Sunday, at the run-up to all European things offering membership talks to Ukraine, and then NATO summit, and at the end of July, all have a joint purpose, which is making the Ukraine operations Trump-proof, sort of trying to establish a tight network of commitments and procedures to basically bring all operations with Ukraine out of the daily political business and get some kind of routine into it. And this is why NATO comes in. I agree, Karen, it's symbolic, but then again, for the German side, it was hugely symbolic because they never ever wanted to have NATO in that so visibly. And so it's a step which mostly costs politically, but doesn't do anything operationally. All things about money, all things about the Rammstein format, all things about the training issue, the air defense, and then definitely the assets, which the Americans definitely wanted to see being used in a much broader way than the Europeans do. Germany's deeply afraid of their assets, of German assets in, let's say, neighboring countries like Poland or Italy being used under different circumstances with much more hostile national governments for war reparations, World War II reparations, or that this whole scheme of using assets would destroy the global financial fabric. So this took endless months of deliberations, and now it's there. I think it's good. It's giving the right signal, and Putin is already shaking. It looks like it, but then again, it's not changing things on the ground yet. And the U.S. Defense Secretary just here in Brussels yesterday, when they had their NATO defense ministers meeting, said there's so much more coming up in the pipelines till the fall, so Ukraine might be much safer coming October. But the big question is what will happen after November 5. All this year is circling around November 5.
I thought it was interesting that Putin, in his remarks, I guess this morning, also said, just to your point about concerns about asset seizing, said in a kind of Trumpian way, today they're coming for us, tomorrow they're coming for you. They'll take your assets next.
Well, when you keep on invading countries, maybe that's what happens to you.
Or breaking the law.
But it is. But I mean, this is why it was. We have a deal in paper, but we don't have a deal in reality. I think Karen, as you rightly pointed out, who's going to put forward the loan is still not decided, and then the mechanics of the collateralization still is to be worked out. So we'll the hope is that it gets done before the end of the year, Trump-proofing in that sense. But whether it actually does or not is TBD, as it always is with these things. Speaking about TBD, Karen, let's a couple of weeks ago, it looked like there was a movement on the ceasefire proposal that the president laid out publicly, actually in an attempt to corner Netanyahu and the Israelis. But as Abba Eban, the former foreign minister of Israel, used to say, the Palestinians never lose an opportunity to lose an opportunity. And it seems that Hamas has said, you know what, if this war doesn't end, and we're not in control when it ends, then we're going to keep the hostages and we're going to keep on fighting, no matter what. It really doesn't seem like we're going to get to a ceasefire agreement. That was the body language from Tony Blinken, not his words. And the president yesterday was also pretty dour on the prospects of an agreement. You follow this as closely as anyone. Where do you think what's the state of play, and is there any way we're going to get to yes?
Well, as you said, Biden was asked yesterday if he thought there was going to be an agreement soon, and he said no. But then said, but we're still hopeful. If you look at what has happened since he made that announcement, everybody waited and waited and waited for a Hamas response, and Hamas came out and said, well, here's our response. It's positive. And Israel said, no, it's not. It's negative. And the Americans, not willing to say, forget it, this is not working, said, well, there were some things that were reasonable and some things that were not reasonable, and we're going to talk about it, which is pretty much exactly what they said in the last round in early May on a very similar proposal. And if you look back, this has been the American proposal really since last December. 3 phases, with the hope that if you can just get one ceasefire, everybody will be so happy with it and will not want to go fight again. And so that will then lead to a more extended ceasefire where you can negotiate some more. This latest one, I think, there have been significant changes throughout. This one, with the most significant, which basically said the first ceasefire will continue as long as there are negotiations. And the goal of the negotiations is a permanent ceasefire and complete withdrawal of Israeli troops. What's not to like about that from Hamas's perspective? The administration keeps insisting this is an Israeli proposal, although I noticed that Jake Sullivan, when he made public remarks on this the other day, kept referring to it as President Biden's proposal, which I think basically it is. What does Israel want now? Israel wants to finish what it's doing, particularly in Rafah. It wants to, whether you use the U.S. description, which is that Hamas cannot be a military or governance structure, or you use the Israeli construction that Hamas cannot exist. I think that's not a recipe for Hamas saying yes. And I think Hamas has sort of changed its position. The administration is quite right that Hamas, this was a Hamas proposal, that there would be further follow-on negotiations to the initial ceasefire that would eventually result in a permanent ceasefire. They've come back and said, no, we would like right away a permanent ceasefire and Israel to commit to this. So, as you say, I don't think there's going to be any resolution soon. And so what you've got is continued fighting in Rafah, including in areas that Israel had said were safe zones. You've got more deaths. You've got the Rafah crossing still closed. You've got the pier at the moment not working again, and the World Food Program, which is supposed to be distributing the aid from the pier, which is now that which has come across is now sitting in a warehouse in Gaza, saying, we don't think that this is what we want to do until we figure out some better security. So, and you've got Lebanon escalating by the day. I think, by some calculations you had last night, some of the biggest exchanges. The administration hopes that a Gaza agreement would calm things down on the border with Lebanon. Hezbollah's has said from the start, we're doing this because it's a protest against Gaza and we're trying to help out our buddies in Gaza. I don't think that that's their reasoning at all. They're doing it because the Israelis are distracted and have got a lot of resources in Gaza. And so, I think that is a huge concern of what if you end up having all-out war. It's a concern not only for Israel, for what happens in Gaza, for the administration. It's a concern about whether this whole normalization that the administration really wants to happen as part of a Gaza solution ever will happen.
That's a bleak prospect here, but I think a realistic one. I mean, Matt, how do you see it? You see it the same way? And if so, what does Biden do?
Well, I think Karen really got it spot on. Is everyone wants this to end except for two parties, Hamas and the Israeli government. Right. And Israel won't end it until they do to Hamas what America did to Al Qaeda and ISIS and completely eliminate it. And Hamas won't accept anything that will kind of that will not let them hold on in some ways in Gaza itself. And Biden can, get blue in the face. And I know it's very uncomfortable for him politically here. But by the way, that Israeli position is supported as divided as Israeli society is politically on everything. On this one issue, you got almost near unanimity that what happened on October 7th cannot happen again. Hamas cannot exist. Full stop.
Yeah, no, that is the problem. And Stefan, I think the Europeans are looking at this, and of course, the humanitarian situation is deeply affecting the populations. What do you think Scholz and Macron and others are telling Biden? Because they don't seem to have any leverage themselves, other than the bully pulpit, which nobody is listening to, not in Israel and not in Hamas. So, what do you see the European mood on this?
I think the Europeans are still inching behind Biden more than ever this past 2 weeks, and his clear positioning on the resolution made life easier for them to justify their position. Germany itself, which was probably the most loyal ally to Israel until now, has clearly signaled that they see too much room between themselves and the Netanyahu government. My assessment is, we were all hoping that Benny Gantz's move a week ago would have changed things dramatically domestically in Israel. That didn't, at least not until now. We'll see how long the smaller war government holds out and how long the coalition will be stable. So I guess that was the entire hope, that things will collapse from within and give opportunities to advance on the diplomatic front. For me, the UN resolution, even though it does have no real effect, is seems to be, from a European view, highly helpful for Biden, because it at least calms his voters on the left and takes a bit away of the pressure he got from his left party wing. So I'm not sure whether this is true from the Washington perspective, but seen from here, it makes his life a bit easier towards the elections. Not entirely, but Europe itself really has no leverage anymore. There's nothing to put pressure on with, and it just adds on sort of the isolation Israel currently has in terms of humanitarian issues and legal issues. So this is a one-sided thing. Let's see when the court procedures move on, when there will be a real indictment for Netanyahu that still hasn't been decided upon, which is unusual because they usually decide within days, or at least not that long. So there are a lot of bullets in their bad picture probably for that war, but there's still a lot to move forward until things collapse.
Karen,
I think what Stefan said is right. I mean, the administration really pulled out a lot of stops to get not only the UN resolution, to get a G7 statement, to get a joint statement by all the countries that have hostages, all of them dual Israeli nationals, but, so that they could come out and say, as they have said, the whole world wants this to happen. But as Matt said, it's absolutely true. It's the whole world except for Hamas and Israel. And so I think that bought Biden some time,
right?
But it's limited.
Yeah, I think it did buy him time, and I think it brought clarity. But you can't, if the buying time is based on a proposal that two sides are rejecting, it does lead to the question: okay, what's your next step? Frankly, the administration for 8 months has tried to hold out the prospect of a diplomatic endgame as the way not to have to make the fundamental choice about what the next step is. And I think Gantz leaving, just as him joining, had no impact on Netanyahu. His leaving has no impact on Netanyahu. The big mistake was made by joining without getting rid of the far right, which is what the opposition wanted to do back in October and make it a government of national unity. That would have given leverage over Netanyahu. There is no leverage other than what the United States provides. And I think my view is the debate in that was quiet for a while, in part because college campuses are empty as people go away, will come back one form or another pretty soon to say where is the leverage going to come from? And Biden will have to face the question of what is it that he's willing to do, because up to now, what he's been willing to do is to use more diplomatic muscle, and very well. But if you can't get the two parties to the table, or at least to an agreement, it's not going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. As the old saying says, you can't win peace more than the parties themselves. And it seems to me that's unfortunately where we are. Not a great way to end the week, but it's the way we've been ending every week since October 7th.
Not an unusual way to end it.
Not an unusual way. So really insightful conversation. Stefan Kornelius of the Süddeutsche Zeitung, Karen DeYoung of the Washington Post, Matt Kaminski of Politico, and thank you three for a really terrific conversation. Thank you all for tuning in, for watching or listening to us. We'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.